This book is fine. It's fine. I mean, it's not great, but here's the thing: it should be great. The critical expectation of this book was that it should have been very, very good. Ta-Nehisi Coates is one of the great writers living today. He's an amazing public intellectual. His essay on reparations in the Atlantic single-handedly changed the discourse on that topic. And so, being known as this brilliant public intellectual, a brilliant writer, his first novel was supposed to be something that blew people away. Everyone was expecting it to be excellent. And when it came out, it was sort of I mean, it's fine. It's fine. It's not a bad book, but it's not at all a great, amazing book, or the book that people, I think, had hoped that it would be. So maybe we might start by asking what in it doesn't live up to the expectations. The first would be, I think that this is a slave narrative in the age of many, many, many slave narratives. Let's think of just a couple that are in this context as well. 12 Years a Slave. I don't know if you saw the movie or read the text or anything like that, but this is realism. And it's a critically acclaimed, award-winning, film. It's this amazing cultural touchstone. On the other hand, we have something like Colson Whitehead's The Underground Railroad, which won the Pulitzer Prize in 2018. And that book, The Underground Railroad, is also about a slave escaping to the underground. Is magical realist, so uses some fantastic elements in addition to its realist depiction of things. And that one was critically acclaimed overwhelmingly. So to have this text come out from such an acclaimed author, Ta-Nehisi Coates, on a topic that's sort of already been done so well by other people, well, it doesn't quite do enough to challenge us. It's neither realist nor magical realist. I don't know, is this sci-fi? Is this the X-Men? It's really hard to know what this book wants to do or what it wants to be. And I think at the same time, as a piece of contemporary fiction, it doesn't quite do all of the things that we expect contemporary fiction to do. It's incredibly slow in its development. We're about 200 pages in right now, and it could be about half as long as it is. The narrator is incredibly verbose, trying to channel this almost 19th century style of writing, but it often feels drawn out and kind of needlessly drawn out. But I do think there are a lot of things to like about this book. The characters, for example, in spite of the slow narration, the characters do have a very complicated set of motivations. The reasons why a certain slave will want to run, the reason why the underground will want to accept some and not others. This is all rich ground to consider psychologically or philosophically or whatever. I enjoy the complexity of the situation that we're in, the way that this renders the sort of social construct of slavery and slave owning as a thing that dehumanizes the master as well as the slave. This is good traditional critical theory, just sort of just thinking through the ways that a system of oppression also dehumanizes the oppressor. And we're getting kind of this rich, almost sympathetic view of a lot of the slave owners. That also enables us to see a much more robust view of the other characters as well. I really also like the way this text is challenging the slave-free binary. The way that Hai is released from slavery into a different kind of slavery, right? You have, on the one hand, he's serving a master, and now that he's free, he's serving a master. Well, yeah, but that other master was a white person. Yeah, but this other master is also a white person. Yeah, but the other master had field hands and house hands, and yeah, well, the underground too has field and house slaves. It's a really troubling idea of what freedom might be as a freedom into slavery. I think that's really interesting. In fact, these 3 points that we're finding of what makes this book valuable in reading conform really closely to the ways that critical race theory will discuss race. So I've given you Richard Delgado and Jean Stefankic's introduction to critical race theory. This introduction is, it's introductory. It's almost insultingly introductory. It really simplifies a lot of the stuff, which on the one hand is very good. Critical race theory is a massive discourse It's far too big to do justice to in the 2 weeks that I have allotted us to spend on it. It's something that should fill entire courses of study. In fact, it justifies entire departments of study at some institutions. This is a massive discourse. So the introductory level that we get it here, I think, is helpful for us. The other thing to say also is that Delgado is a legal scholar. He does law. So our appropriation of this towards literature is not misplaced, but it is something that we can have limited use for from Delgado. Really simply put, critical race theory is this. It is a systematic critique of the context that we are now in. There's maybe two ways to read critical race theory as this systematic critique. On the one hand, we might say that race and racism are symptoms of a larger systematic structure of society. So as these institutions of power negotiate their position in relation to each other as points of tension against one another, one of the things that emerges in consciousness is racial preference. That's maybe a gracious way to read race in this context. Less gracious way would be to say racism is not the symptom of, but is the goal of systems of power. It is not simply that racism is a thing that happens sort of benignly as a whoops, there's racism, but rather the goal of society as it's constructed is to ensure a preservation of racism in our culture. I think the truth of the matter is somewhere between those two things, or maybe both of them at once. We might say that racism emerges out of the structure of society, but power being what it is wants to maintain itself and so works to ensure that racism persists. This is what critical race theory is going to encounter and try to discuss. Delgado gives us 6 tenets of racism. I'm going to run those backwards because I think argumentatively it makes more sense if we go from last to first from what he gives us. So the first one I would start with would be things that most critical race theorists will sort of take as axiomatic, the ground from which critical race theory can emerge. The first is an idea called standpoint theory. This is something I'm sure you've encountered in sociology, something that you have encountered tangentially in literary studies plenty of times, I'm sure. The idea is that your perspective, your position, gives you insight into an issue. That your subject identity, your social orientation enables you to see specific things. Critical race theory will begin with that and say, therefore, the racial subject or the racialized subject is one who can see a certain aspect of society that is otherwise unavailable to us. So think back to Gloria Anzaldúa that we read when we were talking about Oscar Wilde, this idea that the consciousness from the borderlands can speak truth to power in a way that otherwise was unavailable. This is the same sort of thing. Anzaldúa, of course, is a well-known critical race theorist. So the second tenet is this idea of intersectionality. This is, I think, key also for understanding how we begin to move into this perspective. Now, I want to say also, as I begin to talk about race, you may have noticed that I am a white guy. That sometimes makes it difficult for me personally to feel like I can talk about race. Part of the critique of racism is that white voices, white male voices, white able-bodied male voices, white, straight, able-bodied religious male voices have dominated the conversation. I mean, that's me. So I often find it difficult to put myself in a position to say, here's what critical race theory is. In a different sort of context, I would love to step aside and let someone else take the reign and say, here's what critical race theory is. Part of the criticism in critical race theory is for us to acknowledge those who are in power often have a certain look. I'm sure you've noticed this, I think, just by going to class and seeing the people who teach you, for crying out loud. So that means that even though I feel a little bit uncomfortable talking about some of this stuff, That discomfort is something that I will take as being a mark of critical race theory. I should be uncomfortable talking about this because I am the thing that's being criticized in this. That said, as a preface to intersectionality, we will often also find that what critical race theory wants to discuss are things that really are open to a great number of people. The way that it defines intersectionality, I think, is really, really great. The way that Delgado defines this, he says, that intersectionality can be defined as no person has a single, easily stated, unitary identity. Our identities are complex things. They're mashed together from all sorts of places, all these different areas. And to say that we are one particular kind of identity, of course, belies that complexity, that we are fragmented but also prismatic beings. Our identities are comprised of many, many, many different things. He goes on to say, everyone has potentially conflicting, overlapping identities, loyalties, and allegiances. The goal of power in any structure is to disenfranchise voices that would threaten its hegemony. That's what power does. That's how power functions. Those voices that threaten its hegemony are those voices on the margins, those positions, those standpoints that would not be included within power, or that would decry an orientation that references the unjustness of power, that would point out the contradictions in the system of power. These would be things like poor people. These would be things like working class people. These would be things like immigrants. Now, time out. I am all of those things. I grew up poor. I am the son of immigrants, working class. All those points intersect on me to a certain extent. The issue is also that the way our society has been constructed is to concentrate all of these intersections on certain bodies, particularly bodies of people of color. We've put all of those things together. I mean, if you want history of this, you can look at the history of redlining, even just the history of redlining in our own city, in Fresno. There's a reason why Southwest Fresno is not the rich part of town. And it has nothing to do with anything other than, historically, we cut off certain people from having access to certain parts of the city. This is not true only in Fresno. This is true everywhere in the country. Now, those legal barriers no longer exist, but the cultural after effect still remains. And that's, I think, what we need to recognize with this idea of intersectionality. The idea of race, one of the tenets, the idea of race is historically dependent. That is how we define race. What counts as race is something that's always shifting historically. So, for example, you can see in the 19th century the way that Irish immigrants are racialized. But also it has to do with the way that racial stereotypes are represented. Those representations change in a given culture or a different time in a different sort of place in the country. How we interpret race is subject to the conditions that surround us historically. Most critical race theorists will agree that race is a social construct. Now, this is complicated, right? Because we also want to say that there is no ignoring race. We can't pretend to be colorblind. We can't all of a sudden just say that, race isn't an issue or race isn't a problem and pretend like race isn't a thing. But race is a construction. It's a made-up thing, right? It's a historically bound, defined thing. How can we have both those things at the same time? Well, the easiest way to say it is that because a thing is constructed doesn't mean it's fake. The house that I am in right now, this is a construct, and yet it keeps the rain out. So it's doing something right. There's something real about this construct. The fact that it's a construction cues us into the fact that it might be constructed differently. But it should also make us aware of the ways the construction is used and the actions the construction authorizes. Race is a construction, but our valuation of race becomes something different. How does our valuation of race relate to its construction? Fifth, power benefits from maintaining rather than ending racism. This is a kind of startling claim because we want to pretend like the civil rights movement has done all these wonderful things to help raise the position of minorities or raise the position of people of color. The claim that critical race theorists will make is to say that those changes are less about society growing a conscience and more about a change in economic conditions. I think one that we hear a lot of times is the end of slavery somehow being the result of the evangelical movement, right? That you get, people like William Wilberforce standing up there and talking about the moral atrocities of slavery and how this has no place in a Christian nation. The fact of the matter is, in England, when slavery was ended, it had nothing to do with the conscience of the nation. It had everything to do with a change in economic conditions. The slave trade was no longer viable. So slaves get freed. That's how it's done. The aim of critical race theory is to uncover the ways that power will continue to benefit from maintaining these racial distinctions. And when we say power, we also have to recognize, given those intersections, when we say power, we also mean whiteness, because power in our historical present and the construction of whiteness is to say belongs to whiteness. There are two ways that we can see this happening. First of all, as a material benefit, we consolidate resources into fewer white hands. So there are few people who maintain power and control over things, and those people tend to be white people. That's what the system produces. The second is a psychic benefit. This is maybe a little bit more complicated because it wants to address not only elite, powerful people, but also that other intersection of which I've already identified myself in, working class whites, to say that even though you're working class, even though you're not in a position of power or authority, well, you're better than some other people. I might add another sort of part of my story here. This psychic benefit is one that I grew up surrounded by. I've said before that my family were immigrants. My parents immigrated with their parents when they were very young, came to this country and then had to prove that they were white, even though they were poor, even though they had accents, even though they were large Catholic families. They had to prove their whiteness, and to prove their whiteness meant appropriating some of the most blatant forms of racism. I think the last and for me maybe the most important tenet of critical race theory is this: racism is not an aberration. Racism is the status quo. This is even more complicated because as we find later on in this introduction, we're using one word, racism, that means really many things. There are many actions and activities and approaches and perspectives that are being all lumped together in racism. That, by the way, is part of the trick of a racist system. Here's what I mean. We can talk about this idea of racism, of sort of a structure that is directed towards affirming one race over another, and we call that racism. On the other hand, we also say people putting on, white hoods and burning crosses on lawns and doing lynchings is racism. So we sort of placate ourselves by saying, well, I'm not racist. I'm not part of the KKK. Well, that's not all that racism entails. There's a number of other things that get lumped in together with racism. And this sort of structural preferencing, this deep result of the network of power that results in a preference of one race over the other, that too is racism. And yet we can say, but I'm not racist because I don't do that very obvious and evident thing of hating a minority or something like that. Lumping it all into one word is part of the trick. So we can pretend like there's not a problem when there definitely is a problem. What critical race theory wants to do then is address that problem. So what then do we do with the stuff that we're getting from critical race theory and the water dancer? How do we put these two discourses together? Well, I think that one way we can do it is to think about the way that it wants to humanize all of the people caught up in this system. I've already mentioned the way that slave owners in this often get a sympathetic read. It's easy for us to think of slave owners as being these deeply monstrous, horrific people, rather than saying the system of slavery enables people to become monstrous and horrific. What we get in this text is an awareness that everyone is caught, everyone is trapped. There is no out of the system. That's an important understanding, that it's the historical context that makes racism happen. I think another way that we might think about it is the way that Hai is also looking at what freedom might mean, and how he's being given something that is not quite freedom. He's being given the option between one system or another system. This is maybe problematic and something that we can think about as the text advances. Can he choose a different system? Is there an opting out? Is there a way to get away from this system that he's in? Or is Corinne Quinn right, that there is no out, that no matter what, you either serve a master or you serve the underground? Is there a third option that we're not getting here? Is a third option possible?